It is great to have Woody here working in the online program with me. I look forward to the time when Woody is coordinating the online program without Jeff Peterson. Coming soon. Enjoyed very much the presentations by our students, as I always do. Casey's story of the cussing club reminded me of a very important moment in my spiritual pilgrimage that I feel moved to share with you in opening. It was my high school graduation. It was out of doors in the football field at DeMint Stadium in Galena Park, which is now defunct. And as the stadium is defunct, the school still operates. As the Baptist minister was delivering the address, moving in over the stadium was this enormous storm cloud with little flashes of lightning inside it, which I had never seen before, and arrested my attention greatly. And I became convinced at my high school graduation that the Lord was returning. And pretty much all I had learned to do in high school was cuss. That was about it. So I had 7, 8 minutes of the most sincere and heartfelt penitential prayer that I have experienced in my life. And Casey's story reminded me of that. People occasionally ask me, what does a biblical scholar do? Sometimes they ask that sitting next to me on an airplane, which is awkward because you have to stay there and answer and talk about it. Sometimes it's our registrar, Dawn Bond, or our communications director, Lauren Day, asking, what does a biblical scholar do? The short answer to that question is 5 points. Read, think, write, argue, repeat. That's what a biblical scholar does, more or less. And so this morning, Mark, Shipp, and I are going to try to illustrate, to offer a little sample of what it's like when biblical scholars get together and do their thing. The title is The Lord's Supper, Then and Now, and I urge you to listen to the presentation and see if you can figure out how the title fits the presentation so that you can tell me when we're done. In an issue of Christian Studies that came out a bit over a year ago, number 26, I offered an argument for churches of Christ giving some attention and making some use of the Christian year or the liturgical calendar in our public worship and in our private devotion. I grant that argument is a bit counterintuitive for Christians for whom restorationism is an important idea, for those still committed to that. I'd like this morning to offer a few reflections related to the restorationist peg on which that argument was hung in Christian studies. It's based on a few texts in 1 Corinthians. You should have within reach a handout for those who didn't bring your Bible to Friends Day. You should always bring your Bible to Friends Day and be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you. But there are a few texts taken from the English Standard Version. I've modified one passage, and so if you find your attention wandering, you can look for the place where you think I've changed the translation in one point. These reflections will carry some implications for our weekly observance of the Lord's Supper as the church. So even if one finds this argument in Christian studies unpersuasive, I hope there will still be something worth considering regarding our life together in Christ. The heart of the case that I would make is nicely captured in a quotation by Austin Farrer, and it's always good to begin a presentation with an Austin Farrer quote, if you can find one, friend of C.S. Lewis. Farrer writes in 1951, of the yearly Jewish feasts. It's all right. Let's keep it a cappella, okay? Of the yearly Jewish feasts, the primitive Christians kept Passover alone. They kept it yearly, and they commemorated it every Sunday. I've come to think that's an accurate summary of the first century and a half of early Christian practice. Farrer's claim is that the observance of Passover, which is the way the early church referred to Easter, and I suggest is still a preferable way to refer to Easter because it preserves the biblical connection to the Jewish celebration of the feast by which God redeemed Israel and inaugurated the Exodus. Passover was the one fixed point in the early Christian calendar, and the church's weekly observance of the Lord's Supper rehearsed and refreshed the themes of that Passover observance in the church's life every week throughout the year in the continuing constitution of this group of people meeting together as the church. The evidence for Christian observance of Passover can be found, if one looks closely, as early as Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, which I'll confess was a bit of a surprise to me working through this topic. The earliest reference to Passover in any Christian text comes in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7, where Paul declares that Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Let us therefore celebrate the festival, he says, not with the old leaven, the leaven of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. That's part of an argument for the moral purification of the church using the image of leaven for sin and of the removal of leaven that was part of the Jewish celebration of Passover as purging sin and scandal from the life of the congregation. What's striking, and so that's the use that Paul puts the image to in the context of 1 Corinthians 5. What's striking to me is how much the passage presupposes on the part of the readership of the letter, how much knowledge of Passover celebration and the understanding that the passage presupposes of a Christian Passover, Christ as our Passover lamb. This is striking because when Paul characterizes the readership of 1 Corinthians in chapter 12 and verses 2 and 3, he characterizes them as former Gentiles, when you were Gentiles, he says. That is, he doesn't presuppose on the broad part of the congregation a Jewish background. That suggests that if he wants to be sure that his illustration will work and the point will land home, he's got to be able to presuppose something he's previously taught them, something that they've previously heard. They're not hearing about Christ as our Passover and about the details of Passover observance for the first time. He's drawing on prior instruction that he's given them. The passage presupposes that the Corinthians have prior instruction on the Jewish festival of Passover, including the removal of leaven from the home as an element of its observance, and on the eschatological fulfillment of the Passover festival now in Christ. Christ is our Passover, and on that basis, Paul calls for the Corinthians to celebrate the festival by purging sin from the community and responding to his exhortation. Now, it's possible to take that as a metaphor. Let us celebrate the festival. And I think, and many interpreters do. On the other hand, if you envision yourself hearing the letter for the first time gathered as a church in Corinth, which is the context for which Paul wrote the letter. Sorry, I get all choked up when I think about this. Not really. If you envision yourself in that setting, if he's not referring in some way to a literal festival, an actual, as it were, celebration of Passover, I think that passage is going to cause you to pause a bit and fail to give yourself to Paul's argument. As a preacher, right, if you're driving home to a conclusion, you don't want the congregation thinking too hard about the chain of reasoning that you're connecting. You want them to be able to take on board the points that you're making and follow you to the conclusion. So I think the passage works best for Paul's persuasive purpose in 1 Corinthians if there is a literal or actual observance of the festival of Passover in Corinth that Paul can look forward to and anticipate, and can then say, here's what goes along, here's the proper observance of that festival, here's how we ought to do it. That's underscored by the fact that in chapter 16 and verse 8, Paul uses another Jewish reference point on the calendar, Pentecost, and looks forward to his presence with the Corinthians after Pentecost. He's going to stay in Ephesus until then. He's going to then, he looks forward to being reunited with the Corinthians after Pentecost, which suggests two things. It suggests first that he assumes a familiarity with the Jewish festal calendar on the part of Christians in Corinth. He's talked to them about it. Doesn't necessarily suggest that they're observing it. And then secondly, it suggests the reference to Pentecost, that in fact, the point of the calendar where he is, it suggests that the time of year that he's writing the letter is sometime before Pentecost, and so one can envision a circumstance in which the letter is written to be read sometime around Passover time. That's when Paul anticipates the letter will arrive in Corinth and will receive its initial reading. So I'd suggest on balance, it's not a knockdown case, but I would suggest on balance the evidence favors Paul assuming an annual Passover festival being observed in Corinth, and his exhortation picks up on Passover and uses it in that way. That observation or that suggestion isn't outweighed by the fact that in verse 7 of chapter 5, Paul refers to the death of Christ as an event in the past, an event that took place 25 years before Paul writes. In Jewish festal celebrations, the worshipers participating in the feast became contemporaries and beneficiaries of the saving deeds by which God had delivered Israel in the past. The classic text in the Torah is Deuteronomy 5 and verse 3. Not with our fathers did the Lord make this covenant, but with us, who are all of us alive here today. And that's sort of the default stance for participation in a Jewish festival, and one might suggest for the Christian appropriation of the observance of Passover. Paul presents the Lord's Supper, the weekly observance, in that way in chapters 10 and 11. His converts in Corinth, as well as he and his companions in Ephesus, from where he writes the letter, all together partake of the one loaf, chapter 10, verse 17, that Christ broke. They give the loaf that Christ broke and gave thanks over on the night in which he was handed over, chapter 11, verses 23 and 24. That is, it's that same loaf that Christ broke that the Corinthians receive when they come together regularly in worship. There's only one loaf broken in the history of the Christian church, is the way that we might paraphrase Paul's point there. And we're united in that one loaf, receiving it from the hand of Christ. Christian celebration of Passover, if we look ahead from Paul, is firmly established in both East and West in the empire. By the middle of the 2nd century, that's when Christians in Asia Minor and Rome first argued over the date in which it should be observed. Often you learn something about the Christian tradition by seeing when there's an argument about some detail of its observance, and that's the case here. So I'd suggest that there's a good case, which I've only summarized here, that actual ritual observance of Passover annually took place, and that's in view, that Paul envisions that as he sends the letter out. But it's also noteworthy that Passover themes are important to the church's ongoing life and understanding of itself, as we can see especially in what Paul says in 1 Corinthians about the Lord's Supper, which picks up this Passover tradition and reinforces it weekly. As I note in the Fuller paper that Mark has seen, the Fuller, not really more orderly paper that Mark has seen, I did my best. I've made a lot of use of the work here of Dennis Smith. His book, From Symposium to Eucharist, is in its chapters on Paul about the best thing I know of on the early Christian observance of the Lord's Supper. Smith makes the case that the ancient banquet provided the framework for the context for the observance of the Lord's Supper, and that was the context of early Christian worship in the first century or so, especially as visible in the Pauline letters. I would only add to that the precise model of an ancient banquet, Smith sometimes talks as though people had a kind of generic concept of banquet. But nobody's ever attended a generic banquet, right? You can only attend particular banquets. And so my argument would be that the particular banquet that's in view and was used as a model for the Christian observance of Passover and for the less elaborate weekly commemoration of that observance in the Lord's Supper was the Jewish Passover, which is a festival, banquet, a dinner party. Essentially with a religious framework. In 1 Corinthians, Paul, in chapter 10 and verses 1 to 5, describes the Corinthians, identifies them with the first participants in the Passover, with the children of Israel, whose experience sets the pattern for the Christian experience of the Corinthians, draws that parallel between our fathers, chapter 10, verse 1, which is a striking thing to say about people from a Gentile background, right? They've so identified with the tradition of Israel that those Jews, those Hebrews, are our fathers. They were under the cloud, they passed through the sea, that is, Paul says, that is to say, they were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. Very odd way of describing the Exodus story, which you would only make use of if you were trying to describe the experience of Christians in Corinth here as a parallel to that. And then, following that baptism in the cloud and in the sea, Paul says they ate the common spiritual food, they drank common spiritual drink. Whose source was Christ, as Paul puts it. So there's that parallel between those who participated in the first Passover and Exodus and the Christians. The weekly Lord's Supper in chapter 11 is presented in 1 Corinthians as a rehearsal, as involving a rehearsal of Passover themes. Now, the Synoptic Gospels all agree in dating the institution of the Lord's Supper to the Passover festival that Jesus celebrated with his disciples the night before his betrayal and crucifixion. John differs on the dating, but also presents Passover as the context for Jesus' final meal with his disciples, and in fact narrates Jesus' death as occurring at the same time as the offering of the literal Passover lambs in the temple. John's account, as it were, dramatizes Paul's statement, Christ, our paschal lamb, is sacrificed. It's often suggested that such a Passover association is lacking in Paul's account of the institution of the Lord's Supper in chapter 11, but I'd suggest there are several points of agreement between the Pauline and the Gospel accounts which support the conclusion that the tradition that Paul reports, notice in 1 Corinthians 11, in verse 23, Paul isn't talking about something that's brand new that he's instructing the Corinthians in for the first time, nor is he talking about something that originated with him. He's talking about teaching that he received and that he handed on. He says he received it from the Lord, and I'd suggest that's his way of saying that he received it in a tradition a teaching tradition that goes back to the Lord, that originated with the Lord on the night in which he was betrayed. Some would argue, Smith does, that that Paul presents that as coming by way of direct revelation from the risen Lord, as in the Damascus Road experience. But that's not really the way Acts presents Paul's conversion. Right? It's Ananias whom Paul goes to for his catechism. The Lord doesn't tell Paul everything there on the Damascus Road. The Lord confirms the truth of the fundamental claim, the resurrection. by appearing to him. And that's the way I would take the statement in 11:23. Longer argument. So here are the points in common, the points that I would suggest give us a Passover association in what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11. In this tradition that Paul reminds the Corinthians of, Jesus' blessings over bread and wine are remembered as having taken place, quote, on the night in which he was handed over. And the interesting point there is the tradition remembers that this meal, this blessing involving this blessing of bread and wine, took place at night. That accords with the requirement that the Passover be eaten after sundown. We have it both in Exodus chapter 12, in Deuteronomy chapter 16, and in the Mishnah, Code of Jewish Law, dated about the year 200 in its writing, but codifying, incorporating earlier traditions. The fact that the meal took place at night was crucial enough to conveying the significance of the narrative that Paul and those from whom he received this tradition retained that otherwise trivial chronological notice. One might have expected it to drop out if it weren't important. The fact that it's mentioned as the meal's mentioned as having taken place at night is a part of the larger story of Jesus being handed over and crucified that Paul passed on, but B, I would suggest also recalls the Passover setting. Second point, Paul associates the institution of the supper with anticipation of the return of the Lord and his coming in glory. That's 1 Corinthians 11, verse 26. As often as you eat the bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the death of the Lord. That is, the death of the risen Lord. It's both death and resurrection that's in view. The Passover tradition talks about beginning with the humiliation and moving to the glory in the telling of the Passover story, and I think you've got the same thing in the telling of Jesus' death and resurrection from humiliation to glory. This forward-looking eschatological anticipation fits well with the context of Second Temple period observance of the Passover, when the festival is commemorated not only looking backward to God's deliverance of Israel from Egypt, but also looking forward to God's deliverance of his people from present oppression, and looking forward to the institution of the age to come, which was associated with Passover. That's one reason Romans became very nervous when Jews got together to celebrate Passover in Jerusalem and tended to reinforce Jerusalem with troops and whatnot. A third point, words of interpretation, such as Jesus offers, would be somewhat surprising at an ordinary meal, but one doesn't regularly say, here's what this hamburger means, sitting down to eat. But it means we're at McDonald's. But would be more intelligible at a special meal, a festival meal. Where one might, and in the Passover context in particular, interpretation of the different elements of the meal was expected, even if the particular interpretation that Jesus offered, this is my body, this is my blood, was novel and striking and revolutionary. In fact, a fourth point, the suggestion that the offering of Christ's body has atoning force. This is my body, which is for you, as it's recorded in 1 Corinthians 11:24. You've got that same atoning note also in Mark and Matthew, though associated with the cup. This also commends a Passover context, I think, even though it's often taken into account on the other side of the argument. In the first place, the language of the body that's offered for you in Paul, or the sacrifice that's offered for many in Matthew and Mark, echoes the language of Isaiah 53, especially verses 5 and 8. And in Isaiah 53, as we recited it earlier this morning, it's recalled that the servant was led like a lamb to the slaughter. So one has an association to be made there that the early Christians made between the servant, Jesus, who suffered, and the Passover lamb. Secondly, while commentators often discount the notion that there's a Passover connection in this atoning aspect of the sacrifice, pointing out that Passover wasn't an atonement sacrifice in the Hebrew Bible, nor in later Judaism. The Jewish commentator John Levinson observes that, quote, "The unclassifiable Passover sacrifice of Exodus 12 has much in common with the sin offering, for it is through the blood of the Lamb that lethal calamity is deflected, as the mysterious destroyer is prevented from working his dark designs upon the Israelite firstborn," unquote. And fifth, and finally, to our relief, this mention of atoning death in connection with the bread stands in parallel with the reference to a covenant that is pronounced over the cup. Paul and Mark allude to different Old Testament passages, Exodus 24:8, the blood of the covenant, Jeremiah 31, verse 31, the new covenant, in my blood, Paul's version of the tradition adds. But either allusion invites a parallel between Jesus' impending death and God's covenant with Israel that's initiated in the Passover deliverance and codified at Sinai. So all those details of the tradition, I would suggest, commend a recognition that Paul had presented the supper when he introduced it to the Corinthians as a rehearsal of the Passover meal, and he drew its significance from that identification. And one can add that to the evidence that he introduced them to the observance of Passover as well as an annual celebration. Let me close with 2 points that I think as contemporary Christians we can take away from the rehearsal of this New Testament evidence regarding our own life together and observance of the deliverance that God has brought us in Christ. Recognizing that the Apostolic Church observed an annual Paschal celebration, an annual Passover festival, invites Christians like us who have inherited the Puritan suspicion of a liturgical calendar to reconsider whether an annual cycle of observance pinned on Passover. Passover is the high point of the Christian year. Christmas is often regarded that way, but it's really Passover or Easter. That's the climax of the liturgical year, as I discuss in the piece, thanks to the work of a great Methodist writer named Lawrence Stuckey, who has done a couple of great books on early Christian worship, including one on the Christian year. I think it's worth reconsidering whether such an annual observance might prove a helpful aid in the attempt to live out our lives in the power of Christ's resurrection. And this has in practice begun in many of our churches with the observance of Easter Day and the Sunday nearest Christmas Day. Anybody else grow up with, on Easter, the sermon about why we don't celebrate Easter? That's and yeah, the Christmas tree on Christmas. Yeah, that's right. That's not, in my experience, that's not widespread anymore. We're still calling it Easter, and we ought to call it Passover. But I think there's something to learn from the liturgical calendar. Secondly, recognition that Passover formed the context for the Lord's Supper, and that this Passover context was transmitted in the early Christian observance of its weekly commemoration, suggests that Passover motifs ought to find a prominent place in continued Christian observance of the Lord's Supper. And I think there's much that could be done to deepen this association and the significance of that supper when Christians come together. These days, one might be forgiven for drawing the conclusion that the Lord's Supper is a celebration of efficiency, as the point sometimes seems to be to get the bread and the cup shared as expeditiously as possible so we can get on with the song service or the sermon or the announcements or whatever else is the high point of our coming together. Properly, and then this is something that Smith's work helps greatly with. If you're a first century Christian, the Lord's Supper is the center around which everything else rotates. It's why you're there. It's why we've come together. And so I think recapturing that and reviving these themes of Passover, deliverance, anticipation of all that God will do in Christ through us if we commit ourselves to Him, seems to me deserve a regular and prominent place in our life. It's really the Lord's Supper that is the weekly pulse beat of the church's life, in which we receive anew the one loaf that Jesus broke and gave to His disciples, the one cup from which He bids all His followers to drink. And so week to week, He renews us in covenant and extends through us His saving mission. Christ, our Paschal Lamb, is indeed sacrificed. Let us not neglect to keep His feast in sincerity and truth. Thank you.
I want to thank Dr. Peterson for leaving me 1 minute.
By design.
Yes, and I sincerely want to thank him because I find myself in the unenviable position of having responded to his paper, not his presentation. And so, do you have any more to say?
May you go in peace.
Yeah, I'm just about there. Nevertheless, I will surge on and try to do this in a couple of minutes. There is a kind of a lengthy history of articles in the Christian Studies Journal on the Lord's Supper, including one that I wrote some years ago called The Christian Passover, and it had a subtitle, I don't remember what it was, where I talk about the Lord's Supper as the Christian Passover, and I mean that not quite as literally as you did, but almost, as identification where we are identified with the events of the past. They happen to us, not to them in antiquity. In fact, we're sort of required to understand we're part of that trajectory and part of that tradition, that handing on of the faith, which began way back with the events of the plagues and Exodus and so forth. As a memorial feast, and that also was underscored by an article in about 2001, 2002 by Alan McNichol, Do This in Remembrance of Jesus, I think is the name of that article, where Alan focused on the memorial aspect of it. And as Jeff has mentioned today, is eschatological feast. That is a night of watching, we're told, in the Exodus accounts. Kind of curious comment. It's a night of watching for all their generations, right? Down to us. That is, we not only remember things of the past, we identify in the present, and we look forward to a greater feast to come. And I think all those are part of that rich legacy of Passover and Lord's Supper that has been handed down to us. And so I think his larger article, which is only partially what he just did, is absolutely interesting. It's insightful. It was very dense and very difficult for me to plow through, and was not really in my wheelhouse.
Me too.
But yeah, but I think it is fantastic. Peterson, his main point is that the Last Supper of Jesus was an event in history, passed down by Paul and others, rooted in the Jewish Passover. It illuminates the gospel accounts and Paul, where some of those are regularly supposed not to have any reference whatsoever to Passover, and I think Jeff has done a great job of pointing out the importance of that background. I spend 2 pages responding, or page and a half, responding to kind of a minor point in his paper that he did very little with today.
I saw it coming.
Yeah. He presupposes Dennis Smith's work on from Symposium to Eucharist. Dennis Smith talks about a deipnon, that is a meal, and then a symposium, which follows a meal, and then a drinking party that follows with a program of entertainment as the background. I took some issue with that. He suggests that the account, one of the clearest accounts we have, one of the earliest ish accounts of what actually went on in the Passover is in the Mishnah, and that's variously dated sometime between the 2nd or 3rd century AD to the 5th or 6th century AD. Sort of a description of it, a difficult description of it, that the Jewish Mishnah Pesachim or instructions about Passover follows the pattern of this Greco-Roman banquet. The Deipnon, the stage 1 of the banquet, has a cup of wine, an appetizer, a main course, a second cup of wine, and a dessert course, followed by the Symposion, a program after the meal with consumption of wine. Peterson suggests that the Pauline and Synoptic observances of the supper correspond broadly to this outline. And he provides a handy-dandy little structural outline of how the Greco-Roman banquet can be used as kind of a template over a Passover. Broadly is the operative term, without implying there's no connection between the Greco-Roman banquet and the Passover celebration. As we read about in the New Testament and the Mishnah, it seems to me a close connection between the Passover Seder or service and the order of the Greco-Roman banquet is a bit of a stretch. First, the various elements and stages of the Passover are all very symbolic and all a part of the meal experience. In fact, that's what Jeff said today. And so I'm trying to get my head around which Jeff am I representing now? Yesterday's Jeff or today's Jeff? So, hey, I can get laughs too, okay?
I never doubted. It's all a grand unity in my head.
It's all a grand unity, I know. It is to mine too, and I'm just trying to get through this, and I've got less than a minute. No part of it which could be classified as program or entertainment. In fact, I found a little place last night at midnight in the Mishnah which said there is no entertainment allowed after the Passover meal. The afikomen is not allowed afterwards. So I thought, that's kind of interesting. Second, he places the Passover lamb with the Deipnon style meal before the program of reciting the Exodus, whereas the Mishnah, I couldn't find it. Jeff thinks it's assumed. I just couldn't find it. I read different seders, the Passover services, and I found that they're eating all the way through. And so I asked Jeff about it today, and he said, well, of course. So, again, which Jeff am I responding to? Third, a Symposion-style drinking program after the meal is unlikely. There's no indication in the Mishnah that people quit eating before the reciting of the Haggadah or the telling of the Exodus story. There's plenty of drinking before the program also. So which part is the drinking part? Okay, it's all the way through. The entire ceremony is a sacred meal. While in broad outline, Greco-Roman meal convention may have influenced the Jewish Passover Seder, it's better to look for the sociological background of the Lord's Supper, not in these things, I think, but in the fact that there were thousands of years of development of a Passover service, all of which he mentions today, are sort of inculcated in the Passover. And that's basically it. It's a minor issue that I majored in. This is what we do. This is like lunch, okay? This is lunch at Austin Grad. So if you want to see sausage being made, this is how it's made. Okay? Peterson's major point that the Jewish Passover is the background for and illuminates the Last Supper and the continuing Lord's Supper observance in the early church is a very important point that I hope y'all didn't miss. That is regularly not assumed in among scholars, New Testament or Old Testament scholars. There are several rabbit trails that people follow. It seems to me it's the obvious and important point that suddenly passages such as he quoted today, I've never heard this, in Paul, suddenly they come alive with that background. And I think we should be appreciative of the work he's doing, and I hope he continues to work on this project. Thank you.